I don't know if you knew, but REST APIs are eating infrastructure. And this is based on kind of a riff on Marc Andreessen's saying that software is eating the world. And therefore, whoops, I am one slide off. So what did he mean when he said software is eating the world? And what he meant was that the current environment of software, hardware, cloud computing is really perfect for software innovation. And we've seen this through Uber, dominating taxi services. We've seen it with Amazon taking over retail and distribution. We've seen Napster take over and introduce us to streaming music. But so what about infrastructure? And while those are very close to disruption, or those are disruption examples, I'm not really making the argument that REST APIs are completely disrupting hardware. Because as we know, even things like serverless require hardware. The thing with this, though, is that we have the ability now on extra hardware, with extra hardware, to run more interesting things than like a CLI. So when I'm coming from Cisco, I'm a developer evangelist, and I focus on applications and APIs. But now that we've sort of moved beyond just CLI and being able to SSH into boxes and having REST APIs actually on boxes, this actually opens up more opportunities for interesting use cases, especially around DevOps and SRE type practitioners. And so what are the market drivers of this, this new phase of hardware and infrastructure? As I mentioned, one of the things is SREs and DevOps practitioners. Automation has become an expectation. Or probably quite a few of you in this room use cloud services, and those are all enabled by REST APIs. The other thing is that automation itself, of course, is driven by APIs, as you're well aware. And that automation helps us do things faster and simpler and what have you. I think the other factor in this is we have new languages. They're relatively new, especially when you think about Node.js, but Python, they're easy to use and make it really easy to actually access REST APIs. And so, like when we started DevNet 4 years ago at Cisco, we were thinking, well, we've got some skeptics out there, and the skeptics are thinking, well, we don't really need REST APIs. These are kind of a fad, and they're going to go away. We'll just use our traditional CLI and so on. But that has changed significantly. We have pervasive APIs across all of our platforms now, and it's pretty awesome. And let's see, I went way back. Apologies there. Okay, so really what this boils down to is we've got this concept now of infrastructure as code. And so let's look at some examples of that. Most of you probably have heard of Terraform. Terraform is a really awesome product for doing DevOps. And the capabilities there are really enabled by REST APIs. Let's look at Ansible. Ansible is a combination of using REST APIs as well as things like SSL or SSH. So you're getting your configuration management and your deployment all through the benefit of infrastructure as code talking to REST APIs. So if you go way down to the network layer, SREs and DevOps have been used to automating lots of things at the application layer. And now with REST APIs on these boxes, you can implement things like CI/CD for doing network changes or data center changes. And all of that code, that infrastructure stored as code, is available in source control. So you know when things have changed, or if things are broken, why it broke, and who broke it, so you can get back to them. So we're calling this sort of NetDevOps because, of course, there's SecDevOps, and now there's NetDevOps, but all enabled through REST APIs. So you can see how these infrastructure products are being completely used in new ways and interacted with in new ways because of APIs. So there's even more examples. Kubernetes. Kubernetes is really kind of an API for infrastructure, for your computing resources. Docker, in some ways, is an API to compute. And even for us, outside of making some of these changes at the device level, we've made changes in the way that we architect our solutions for customers, because we have a concept that's called a controller that then spans across all the devices. So you have REST APIs at the controller layer, and then REST-conf, which is a REST-like API into specific devices. And so those two things can interact. And so all this stuff is enabled by REST APIs. So you might think to yourself, well, we're at a Postman conference. What do they have? So if you go to this URL, you can actually check out the Postman collections that we have for some of our infrastructure. I was talking to one gentleman earlier today about Meraki, which is a Wi-Fi cloud-based Wi-Fi system. And he's thinking about, hey, can I do application deployment to using Fastlane, using the Meraki APIs to push my application once it's done into a device in the enterprise. So these kind of are new opportunities for the infrastructure world to be available for you. So kind of riffing off the Marc Andreessen software is eating the world, I assert that REST APIs are eating infrastructure, and it's really the way we interact with infrastructure. It's not that the REST APIs are munching them and getting them completely replaced. So we're going to stop doing things like manually interacting with our devices using SSH, or using fragile interfaces like using expect scripts to screen scrape and then do things programmatically. We'll have nice defined contracts of our systems, of our configuration and management that's now available for you to try out. So as practitioners of DevOps or SRE, it helps us really build solutions faster that are more reliable. So I'd be curious if anyone out here has examples that they've maybe occurred to them while I've been talking about REST APIs eating infrastructure. If you want to learn more about DevNet and the things we have, you can go to developer.cisco.com. Any comments or questions on that? Ooh, I've stunned them. And I'm also between you and lunch, so I understand that too.
Yeah, I'm afraid that might be it. So, any last questions before we?
Does anybody disagree with this?
Oh, here's a question. Here we go.
I was curious if your website linking to Postman collections is a replacement for public API docs.
It is not. We have, because any of the sort of generated documentation like that, and I know that Postman collections are somewhat manually generated, they don't replace things like tutorials or code samples. And so we have the belief that we're combining those things along with more specific granular things like either Swagger documentation, OpenAPI spec documentation, as well as Postman collections. So ultimately, you have to understand those use cases in order to then put the API to use. And so you need full documentation, not just something like a Postman collection, my opinion. Yeah?
So what's your process for when the API changes to update your Postman docs? Like, is there a person that's like waiting for the API to change and then it updates it right away, like a documenter, or do you have the developer updating that Postman docs?
Right. So did everyone hear that? What's the process for updating our collections? It's going to depend. So we're a large organization with lots of different engineering teams that do things differently. But I would say typically it's the engineering team that they have the opportunity to update documentation. So that would be probably the initial attempt. That's what I would recommend. But additionally, then maybe you have the doc people, if there's a doc team that's involved, so they would do it. Or maybe it might fall back on evangelists like me. So some of, like the Meraki collection, that was created by an evangelist team. So they're going to be tightly coupled with the engineering organization in order to stay in touch.
Do you ever fear that they might get out of sync? Like,
Of course, they will. Yeah, I mean, inevitably, if it's not automated, it will get out of sync. But if your engineering team is communicating effectively with the rest of the organization and saying, hey, we have a release coming, and then those other people, that are doc people or evangelists or what have you, can then do the things they need to do to make it, stay in sync. Yeah. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.